Jasper Rose is leaving next week, and in a desperate effort to get some more of him to keep actors gone, we're producing this occasion. Jasper Rose, as everyone knows, is the biggest phenomenon that UCSC has, and it's a lot bigger than any of us really know. And we've asked him on this occasion to just let us in on his earlier life, or the rest of his life, the pre-UCSC portion of it. He represents something bigger even than himself. There is a whole epoch that probably is gone, and I've always felt enormously curious about what that epoch is. So we've asked him to talk about the influences that have been important in his life. UCSC students who take his classes, well, some of them at any rate take them because they want to know what UCSC used to be like. On this occasion, I really would like to know what Victorian England was like. And I think of him as simply the last of the great Victorians. But it's a kind of, there are all sorts of archaeological possibilities, I think. The other aspect of this is that we thought we really ought to produce something for the grandchildren of UCSC students, so that they can bring those kids around and show them that Jasper Rose is real, and this is what they've been talking about. Well, I think Tareen and I will be sitting in back of the camera, and we'll just ask Jasper to say whatever comes into his mind in connection with this occasion.
Well, thank you, Bert. First of all, I'm interested to think that I'm unreal, which I suppose is true, and that I'm like some kind of crumbling facade, which is also true. And what is behind the crumbling facade, nobody knows, least of all myself. I also like to think that I'm some sort of elephant. I used to say to my classes, would those of you who are doing this in order to fulfill a requirement put up your hands? And then I would say, and how about those of you who've just come to feed the elephant? And many students had obviously just come to feed the elephant. Of course, an elephant is notorious for memory. No beast has a longer memory than the elephant, which is no doubt why Bert suggested that I could remember Victorian times. And indeed, it does ring a special bell, because I was once very, very cross with an extremely vain graduate student who pretended that he knew everything and was treating me as being a noble piece of mouldering senectitude. So I leant forward to him and I said, "Rather cold this evening, young man, isn't it, my dear fellow? Rather cold. It reminds me of the Crimean campaign. But I forgot to bring my balaclava helmet, didn't I?" And he looked at me, a bit perplexed. It was clear that he wasn't sure whether I was 93 and was talking about the Boer War, whether I, suffering from senility, was talking about the Second World War, or whether indeed I was 192 and had survived the charge of the Light Brigade. But anyhow, it was a very charming introduction, Bert, and thank you very much for it. Now I suppose you really ought to be more particular and ask me something, of a more detailed kind, to fuel my sense of amusement and the pleasure of this occasion, which indeed is very great, surrounded by such lovely blossoms and books.
Well, what we're all curious about, as I've explained to you, I think, is we want to know how you got to be Jasper Rose.
Well, my dear, most people get to be who they are by a rather similar process. There are no special records as to whether there was any enjoyment at my begetting, but there is a very charming story about when I was born. my father, who was extremely short-sighted and on the whole a very sweet-tempered and good and kind man, is said to have come to the nursing home and peered at me for a bit, and then said to my mother, who was full, of course, of maternal pride, and said, "Give me a fortnight to get used to the idea of it." And the explanation of that was that I had a very large quantity of curly black hair, and already, obviously, was wagging my eyebrows rather furiously. And I suppose really the right place to start is with one's parents, and both my mother and father were, in their own very different ways, extremely, if not remorselessly, literary. They weren't successfully literary in any very special sense, but books were really what mattered more than almost anything else to them, I think, except dancing. There is a famous family story that in Vienna, as members of the Pen Club, that strange defunct, or almost defunct, international club of literary people, they stopped the mayor's ball in Vienna by the beauty of their dancing, because my father was 6'4.5", and my mother was 5'10.5", and my sister was 6'2.5". So, elephantine though I may seem in the context of Santa Cruz, I really am the baby of that family. Apart from dancing, my parents eschewed any kind of violent or even moderate physical activity. My father once ran to catch a bus. It was a very ill-advised proceeding. He damaged a trouser and a leg, and the bus sailed off triumphantly without him. I suppose you could say that he was a very absent-minded professor, an extremely diligent man. He probably edited something like 400 books altogether, because he was devoted to the business of educating the poor people. And thus he started a series which was called Ben's Sixpenny Library, which was concerned with providing up-to-date information and ideas on a huge variety of topics, and which he thought poor people would be able to afford. It was a kind of preliminary to the enormously successful Pelican books put out by Penguin. There are one or two amusing stories about my father and this series. He wrote to Dean Ing, who was an extremely famous cleric, and who was Dean of Westminster Abbey, and a well-known journalist, amongst other things, because my father thought that Dean Ing might be the person to write a life of Christ. And he got a charming little postcard back saying, "Thank you very much for the invitation. As a Church of England man, I'd be delighted to do it, but unfortunately the materials for a life of Christ do not exist." It's a sort of interesting 1930s version of the 1960s movement, honest to God. But I prefer Dean Ing's version to Bishop John Robinson's version, who simply said, "God doesn't exist, but I'll go on wearing my gaiters." At least, I think that's roughly speaking his attitude. Anyhow, my father tried to teach me German. He tried to teach me a number of other things, and we had a tremendous contest. I was, I suppose, about 7 at the time. And there were always constant conflicts with my father. But this one, we got a little notebook, and we were doing Ich bin, du bist, er ist. And I think we got a Wir sind. And I wrote it down wrong. And so I said, "Papa, I will cross this out." And he said, "No, please, rub it out." So I said, "No, thank you very much, I will cross it out." He said, "No, I'd rather you rubbed it out." So I said, "No, thank you, I do not wish to rub it out, I will cross it out." He said, "No, you must rub it out." So I said, "But the paper is rather thin and cheap. If I rub, there'll be a hole in the book." He said, "No, you must rub it out." So I said, "Well, I'm not going to learn any more German in those circumstances, thank you very much." And to this day, I've never known any German, which is why I suppose I feel that I'm something of a second-rate scholar, as German is such a sacred, if indubitably guttural kind of language. So you can see something of the ambience within which I was brought up. My mother always loved to tell stories, much to the detriment of my father, and stories which had some kind of quizzical meaning as far as I was concerned. A favourite one was at about the age of 3 or 4. It came round to Guy Fawkes's night, which, as you know, is an English celebration on the 5th of November for rescue from the gunpowder plot, when Guy Fawkes and his confederates were going to blow up the House of Parliament. And every year there's a bonfire, and on the bonfire you put a guy. And my mother, with the help of my elder sister, had made a very beautiful guy out of old clothes and stuffing and straw. And I'd become very fond of this guy. No possible explanation given. And then, as my mother said, I said, "Oh, no, no, please don't burn the guy." So my mother said, "But you know, we won't have anything but on bonfire." So I said, apparently, heartlessly, magnanimously, and oedipally, "Oh, don't burn the guy. Burn father instead. We can surely do without him." And my father was keenly interested in psychoanalysis and wrote about psychoanalysis in literature. And I suspect even he was delighted by the story, because while it wasn't very polite to him, it certainly confirmed the omnipresence and absolute vivacity of the Oedipal complex.
You sound as if you were Jasper Rose right from the beginning. Is that true?
Well, in some senses yes, in other senses no. I was not a childish child. I was initially I was rather a tender plant with rather poor health. There's a photograph of me at about the age of 2.5, looking as though I'd emerged from some kind of Barnardo's home, or even worse, a Cowell home, with a kind of puckered little look on my face. I'm always capable of looking immensely tragic. It's been one of my great benefits in life, to be capable of an immediately tragic expression and white hair. They're the two things you need to succeed in academia. Brains are not necessary if they're well covered with a good thatch of silver hair. Anyhow, I was sickly, and I, as a child, did not believe in reading. I began to gather a number of reproaches from my parents. But again, my mother records that thinking was much more important than reading. So clearly the priggish element in my life was only manifest. And as I say, I was not very fond of children. I was never very fond of people of my own generation. And that, I think, is something which has survived with me. The colleagues of my own period, I find, with of course suitable and delightful exceptions, rather tiresome creatures and largely speaking misguided. I prefer people who are older than myself and people who are younger than myself. People of my own age, I tend to quarrel with. I don't know quite why. I was not a very cheerful boy. When I succeeded in throwing off the Dr. Barnardo's look, I got a look of a sort of German expressionist, as though I might have been a minor character in the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Extremely soulful and wistful, but cheerfulness eventually broke in. At about the age of 13, I was much more noticeably, no more genuinely shy than I am now. I'm very shy, in fact, but in my early youth, I would hide away from people a very, very great deal. So I don't know that it is entirely true that we all undergo changes. But you know, I'm not the person I was in 1965. But a kind of rather second-rate rubicundity came over me at about the age of 12 or 13. Puberty sprouted rather early, and my mother, who was a person of tremendous girth and grandeur, and like myself capable of immense indignations, was always having rows with my teachers, and my teachers recognized that she was a formidable person. And when I went to an English public school, which was very, very conventional in a great many ways, the headmaster was always fidgeting with her and suggesting to her that I was improperly turned out a lot of it revolved around the fact that I was her student. And he would say to her, she would say to him, why aren't you teaching him Greek? And he would say to her, madam, why is he not shaving? And she had very little sense of what an English public school required. So that I was constantly sent with the wrong clothes, and you cannot imagine what an agony that is for a boy at a public school. We were asked to wear khaki corduroy trousers. My mother always provided me with green corduroy trousers. And I mean, it was almost as though she christened me Oscar Wilde as well. And then the headmaster would say in public assembly in front of 400 people, there are some boys who deem it proper to appear in trousers unorthodox, indeed conventionless colour, which is indeed offensive. And out of the corner of my eye, I have actually noticed a shade of green on the nether portions of some young man. This must stop. But of course it couldn't stop because I wouldn't have had any trousers at all if I'd not had these green ones. So that gives you some idea of my mother and father. They were gregarious, and we lived in a very charming house in London near the Portobello Road, and there used to be lots of parties, and at the parties a very favourite game of the 1930s, for instance, would be played, which is called murder, and all sorts of distinguished literary people would blunder into my sister and my nursery, seeking a suitable victim to murder. Fortunately, we were never actually murdered, but there were all sorts of midnight incursions. As a small boy, I like to pretend that I can remember, for instance, a very famous Russian writer called Prince David Mirsky, with a great big Russian beard, leaning over my cot and saying something in one of the 35 languages which he had picked up during the course of his Russian education. Well, Prince Mirsky went back to Russia in the middle of the 1930s and was never heard of since. But his history of Russian literature remained the authority for many, many years. And then there were all sorts of other people. My mother was the secretary of a man called Sir John Squire for a while. And if you read deeply in the incessant memoirs of the Bloomsburys, you will find Sir John Squire sort of on the edges, a piece of unsavoury marginalia. Partly, I think, because he played cricket and he enjoyed British marmalade and was a minor poet and belonged to the opposing force, indeed led one of the opposing forces in the literary battles of the 20s. He was editor of the London Mercury for a while. I remember him because he was, in fact, a notable drunkard. He was also supposed to be my godfather, and we used to go to his house on occasion to rather sort of shambling parties, and I seem to remember at the end of one of these parties, Sir John Squire, looking like Bardolph, with a brilliant red nose, full of little white pimples, and feeling rather the worse for wear, and myself about the age of 6 also feeling rather the worse for wear, and then he said, oh, I think you're my godson, or something like that, pulled a little penknife out of his pocket and gave it me, which was nice of him. But my mother and father said, oh, no, you're too young to have a penknife, you'll cut your fingers off, or something like that. And I said, it's the bluntest penknife I've ever come across. You couldn't cut the finger off, you couldn't cut a banana with this penknife, can't I have it? No, you can't have a penknife, you don't know how to use a penknife. Penknives are very dangerous things. So there was this kind of literary world. It was made more complicated by the fact that in the 1930s, as you will remember, floods of refugees came to England. On the one hand, in the public histories, it's often said that the English were less than generous in allowing refugees from Hitler's Germany to come in, But of course in the private history, a very large number of people were deeply concerned and extremely hospitable. And my father was always being rung up on the telephone, and then a long conversation would ensue in German, and then some interesting German literary figure would appear for a few days. Indeed, there was one called Jessner, who was a friend of Max Reinhardt, and a very distinguished producer, who in the 1930s was often in our house. I recall him as being rather like an ecstatic hippopotamus. And later on I was told that he and his family were very, very German and never slept less than 3 to a bed. And he had a stepdaughter called Lotte, or half-daughter called Lotte. He was quite an enchanting woman. And he used to encourage me in my earliest ambition, which was to be a musical conductor. And then he went on and came to Hollywood, where he was, I think, largely speaking, a failure. But many, many refugees, including some very young ones, a girl called Renata, who was totally intolerable. She was about 16 years old, and no doubt because she was absolutely uprooted, was very sorry for herself, but she took out her sorrow in ordering my sister and myself around, weeding the garden, and we didn't take to this very much. But there were all these refugees and many other literary personalities. My mother was besotted by an elderly man called Henry Wood Nevinson, who was born in the 1860s and was one of the first war correspondents, a man of colossal handsomeness. And by the time I met him, in his mid-70s, late 70s, but enormously distinguished, enormously sprightly. My mother would say, well, you must think about him, you must worship him, and being a good and somewhat biddable boy, I did. So that's part of my early life. I could go on without interruption if that's what you want, but I think it would be nicer if, like some of my students, you would occasionally feed the elephant with a bun of a different flavour.
How about Cambridge? What was Cambridge like?
Well, Cambridge, of course, was a different world, and was a much later world, and in order to get to Cambridge, I really have to go through a series of schools which are not quite like Do the Boys Hall, but are all of them full of eccentric schoolmasters. And I suspect that it is true of many, many English people that their school days mark them more deeply than their university days. And certainly my school time was peculiar, having this capacity to grow green at the gills on the slightest provocation, having also this ability to look like little Lord Fauntleroy with a touch of Svengali thrown in. At my first school, which was staffed almost entirely by tender ladies, I was a tremendous success. So much so that they wanted to keep me on forever. And my mother had really no objection to that. So I eventually became the only very superannuated boy in a girls' school. And then it was realised that this was probably not terribly good for my psyche. And so finally I was passed on, but not before I'd been conquered and conquered. Miss Baker, who had the most beautiful, beautiful blue eyes, Miss Burt, who had brown ditto, rather like currants in a large currant bun, and who I met subsequently. She said, about 20 years later, when she saw, no, 18 years later, 17 years later, when she saw me, no, 16 years later, when she saw me in some theatrical production, she said, it suddenly tumbled to me, you were that darling little boy at Kensington Girls' High School. But I remember that very, very clearly. I have a very strong visual memory, and I can remember playing in the sandpit there, and I remember the first day, I remember the great joy of the spelling bees. They did it with little ladders, you know, and every person had a little cardboard mannequin, and you spelled something right, and up the ladder you went, you spelled something wrong, down the ladder you would go. That was really quite exciting. There was one other boy who became superannuated there, a boy called John Tho, and he always seemed to me to be about 72, even at the age of 6 or 7. He had a little quavery old man's voice, and he would say, oh, well, are we going to be with these girls? Anyhow, I went on from there. My My mother had the ambition that I should go to St. Paul's School, which is one of the great London day schools. Very, very strong. G.K. Chesterton, whom she much admired and had met during the course of her literary wanderings, had been at St. Paul's. So I was sent off to the preparatory school to St. Paul's, which is a place called Colin Court, after Dean Collin. It was a great rambling place, and full of the most eccentric schoolmasters you could possibly imagine. And that was a time when I first became conscious of certain elements of it's not exactly anti-Semitism. The British are not in a very straightforward way anti-Semitic. They'll just know that Jews aren't quite as good as other people sometimes. And anyhow, that school, the Jews, when it was prayers time, the Jews had to go into the gymnasium. They weren't improved by the gymnastic feats, they just had to stand at ease, and the prefect would come by, and any Jewish boy who twitched would get a nasty cuff on the back, round the back of the head. And that was a typical form of punishment, probably called. But the schoolmasters were very, very interesting. There was one called Dickie Downs. Now, I must be about 8 at the time, and Dickie Downs was a very, very large man with a very carefully waxed moustache and a beautiful waistcoat with a large watch chain and a very ample corporation, taught chiefly French, and smelt of most exquisite perfume, so that you knew he was coming, and even more, you knew he had passed. And amongst the stale aroma of small boys, the smell of, I don't know whether it was gardenia or begonia or something, was remarkably fragrant, but he had a very unhappy, I mean, you remembered most of the schoolmasters by the forms of torture they submitted you to. And Dickie Downs would take you by the sideburns, and he'd twist the sideburns round and round and round and round, till he got a little nice screw of sideburn, and then he'd slowly lift you. But he didn't lift the same way with both hands, so one hand would be rather slower, so your head would tilt this way, then your head would tilt that way, and of course it left no trace. HM inspectors would never discover it, except it left a permanent trace in the memory of one small boy. But after all, that small boy had been very wicked in Mr. Downs' form, because in those days you used to have real ink, and real inkwells, and real dip pens, and real blotting paper, and the amount of mess you could make with that equipment was quite fantastic. And then both of your fingers would become, or both of your hands become deeply imbrued with this rather sticky, viscous, dark blue fluid, and then the ink pot could be croofed up out of the desk from below and jump in a rather exciting fashion, spilling vast quantities of ink, and then say, "Oh, sir, I'm terribly sorry, sir, but the inkwell went." And then you would be twisted up. But then, of course, the moment Dickie Downs' back was turned, a little ink pellet could be flicked down the neck of the boy sitting in the desk in front of you. And then there was Mr. Napper, who fancied him that Dickie Downs taught French. Mr. Napper taught classics, and he had a rather scimitar-like face and probably needed to shave 3 or 4 times a day. And the pubescent interests of the boys began to sort of concentrate upon why this could be quite so, and how could he be so desperately and overwhelmingly hirsute, and could they see any signs of the forest that must lie below his stiff collar, sprouting out suddenly. But his form of punishment was every boy in the class had to sit, as I recall, more or less permanently with their hand up. And then if they made a false quantity with their Latin, if they couldn't do their conjunctions or their conjugations or their irregular verbs, Mr. Napper, hirsute Napper, with his canary yellow waistcoat and with his very, very sharp eyes, carried with him a riding switch. And down would come the riding switch onto your open palm. I became quite good at Latin in those circumstances. But the moment the riding switch, of course, was removed, my Latin collapsed. It was not a very good method of teaching. And I suppose it was from Mr. Napper that I learnt something about the difference between carrots and scorpions, and whips and rewards and fairies. They were an eccentric lot. And then I mean, one of the things that I think one has to realize is that my father was Jewish. There were all these German refugees. There was indeed a very charming Italian refugee called Ginetta Rottona as well. It was impossible for one, however much one wanted, to be unaware of the fascist threat. Indeed, in my family, the fascist threat was obvious by 1933, 1934. And my mother and father were busy writing letters to Anthony Eden and Duff Cooper and so on. And then, of course, the Second World War came along, and that happy school in London was all distributed to the winds, and we were evacuated to an enormous mansion with no less than 4 courtyards, and a great ballroom which was modelled without much diminution on the Salle de Glace in Versailles, and a huge banqueting hall with its own organ. And I was asked to pump the organ. I don't know whether any of you have ever pumped an organ, but it's quite hard work. And there's a little weight which is called a mouse, which is on a string, you know. And you watch, pump like mad, and the mouse comes down, and then you breathe a sigh of relief, and then the organist plays an enormous chord. The mouse goes right up again because all the air is used to pump like mad again. So I got delusioned of grandeur at that stage, because you know there's this huge, huge, wonderful mansion which was furnished almost entirely with oars. The man who lived in it was the son, I think, probably of a very, very successful brewer, and it was built about 1900. But he really had no claim to fame, except that he rowed rather well, either at Oxford or Cambridge. So he had hundreds and hundreds of oars on all the walls. I mean, the most extraordinary kind of thing. You go into a room and you were about to be pressed into a slave galley, and that a quig marine of Nineveh was your ultimate fate. Something like that. Terrifying for me, because another thing which I haven't told you about, but I told you I wasn't very well. My parents thought I should have country air, so I was sent to a baby farm, and mother and father went on the continent, and my father would translate, and my mother would then aid him in translation to earn a little bit more money, and my sister and I would go to this baby farm in the country. My sister loved it a lot, but I had a lot of food phobias, and it was all well. I had a lot of food phobias, and so it was a constantly pain to be at a sort of early boarding school, because, you know, one would be given the most terrifying food which one would have to eat. The people who ran it were meant to be very advanced in point of view, Miss Thompson and Mrs. Thompson, her mother. No doubt they were, but they were very terrifying ladies. Miss Thompson was a person who tied up her hair in a very, 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 very tight bun first thing in the morning, and as a result she couldn't blink, so her eyes were bright blue and staring all day long, and I was used to imagine what happened when she released her hair at night. I think it was probably a way of dealing with insomnia. Quite suddenly the lids no doubt fell and stayed lowered for 8 hours and then be tightened up again. Her mother was terrifying in a different way. She had bright, yellowy brown eyes, and very big eyebrows, as though she were a sister of Rudyard Kipling. Behind, you know, there's things that terrify small children. There's very large spectacles, you know, that kind of thing. When suddenly you look at somebody and their eyes are large enough, you know, to eat you with or something like that. You know, that kind of thing. I'm sure as children you all remember that. Anyhow, she was like that, and that was frightening enough, but she also had a very, very shaky hand, you know, and the custard would come whirling towards you, sort of shaking and taking a kind of horrible froth on the top, and then she'd pour some and you'd, no, Mr. Thompson, please, please, I don't want... And you could hardly distinguish between the custard and the parsley sauce. I should tell you one other thing which I remember very, very clearly from these early years, and that was Sunday, because Sunday was the only bearable meal of the week. We sat at very beautiful, absolutely beautiful oak refectory tables on lovely benches. I mean, beautiful furniture. It's a beautiful house in Cotswolds, this baby farm. But the food was horrible. And then we had to take rest, which seemed to be abominable. And there was very severe kind of potty training, except that Miss Tompi would simply forget we were left on our pots. And, you know, she'd go away. And she was a strict disciplinarian, so none of us dared to get off our pots. You know, and then we'd shout through the house, "Miss Tompi, I finished!" And there would be no answering sound. So we'd shuffle along on the linoleum of the upper floor, you see. And then eventually we'd be released with great bright red rings round our near little behinds. An hour and a half later, perhaps. Anyhow, on Sundays, the food was bearable. In fact, it was rather nice and pretty because, you know, there's always salad and cold meat, and the salad had boiled eggs cut, you know, and so you had these beautiful little yellow and white rings, and then there were always radishes and little red and white rings, so it was lovely to look at. But the thing was rather agonizing because on Sunday we weren't allowed to talk at lunch. And I think Mrs. and Miss Tompi had been to church, and the only people who actually talked were Mrs. Thompson's stomach, and Miss Thompson's stomach, and from one end to the other end, you know, of these long refectory tables, there'd be a little message. And then Mrs. Tompi would cry. Miss Tompi would say, and we were silent. And I mean, of course, it was the funniest thing you could possibly imagine. We rocked and fro, and you could feel, because we were on these benches, you could feel your next door neighbour just about dying with suppressed giggles, you know, and you thought, can I suppress mine? And you look guiltily across. Funny times they were, funny times. Anyhow, it didn't give me much taste for boarding school, but to boarding school I went. And eventually I went to a very interesting military school. And that's where I suppose my aesthetic and literary tastes were really, well, two schools. I went for a short while to a grammar school as a boarder. And it was very badly run, because the headmaster was just simply very old, and the rumour was that big pieces were falling off him, you know, and we would look at his hands, which were swathed in bandages and painted kind of bright blue, and we'd hope that a bit of the hand was still left. But he used to fall asleep. We used to go to his study for Greek, and there was a gas fire, and he would fall asleep, and then we'd just listen with bated breath to the gas fire go, and hope that we wouldn't wake him up. But he really couldn't run that school any longer. And it was very antique, which had one very lucky aspect to it. There was a library there, which consisted entirely of 19th century books. I mean, they hadn't added a book to that library since about 1900. You see, really, actually, this library might take note of that, because as a result of it, I know a great deal about many aspects of English literature which no professor on this campus is vaguely aware of. I discovered, for instance, Charles Lever. I discovered Jules Verne in early editions. I discovered books which I can't even remember the titles of any longer, which date from that antique period, you see. And I discovered quite suddenly Vanity Fair at the age of 11. And Vanity Fair is really a book for the 45-year-old, I think, and even then to be taken, you know, in small doses. But I thought I discovered the real truth about life, which was that money counted, and that girls with green eyes and insinuating manners should be avoided at all costs, and that, you know, one should walk about saying, "Oh, damn fine cigar," and that sort of thing. It was a great revelation. And then I went on to that school. Now, it was a military school. It had been evacuated at the beginning of the war because the government wished to take over the premises. They almost completely killed the school, and then they said they didn't want the premises. So after about 6 months it came back in sadly defeated state, and a progressive headmaster was appointed. And that progressive headmaster appointed a very sweet, funny man, who's a minor literary figure, called Paul Bloomfield. And Paul, we had known because he lived in our village, and he worked for the BBC, and he wrote a book about almost everything. He wrote a book about the Mediterranean, for instance. And then he wrote a book about the political thought of the Greeks, the many and the few. And then he and his wife wrote a charming anthology of travel. And then he wrote an autobiography called Half the Battle, which he lost. And he was probably going to do the other half of the battle pretty well. And then he wrote a book about William Morris. And he reviewed and spoke and administered in a very gentle kind of way. And he was also a very charming amateur draftsman and painter with very strong feeling for caricature. And he was a most enchanting teacher. He always came to class wearing a really rather horrible overcoat and a dark olive green porcupine hat. And the classrooms in the school were provided with rather large and handsome desks. And we would sit there, and Paul would gradually disappear behind his desk. He'd sink slightly like this, until nothing was visible at all. And he was leaning back in his chair against the wall. And then he developed a wonderful trick, which was just to make his hat lift off his head. So you would suddenly see a hat rising above the desk, but no head. And he'd do that 2 or 3 times, and then he'd say good morning. And he would re-emerge, and you knew that this was not a dangerous man at all. This was a very sweet man. And he had wonderful capacity, in a very gentle way, to dramatize what he was talking about. And I should never forget Tess of the D'Urbervilles, because he acted it out so perfectly. And he got up and became the curate. Remember the beginning of Tess of the D'Urbervilles, going along the road. Good morning, D'Urberville, he said. Morning, sir, said D'Urberville. Next day. Morning, D'Urberville, my man. Morning, sir. Good morning, Sir Thomas D'Urberville. Morning, sir. Sir Thomas? Yes, Sir Thomas D'Urberville. And there was laid out the opening scene of that great novel. And he had a lovely wife. Quite the most extraordinary person in a way that I've ever come across. And I only realized 25 years later, no, 20 years later, that I was madly in love with his wife. It was so exciting and delightful at the time that I didn't realize that it could be described by so mundane a word as love. I used to go and visit the two of them every afternoon. He would be taking a nap underneath his hat, and she would then indulge me in literary conversation. And she indulged me in literary conversation about English novelists, about Russian novelists, about poets, about George Meredith, about Thomas Hardy, about Thackeray, whom she didn't terribly approve of, about Dostoevsky, about Turgenev. She tried to interest me in more recent literature, but on the whole didn't succeed there all that much, but interested me in talk about life and the happy and amiable dissection of this schoolmaster and that schoolmaster. She was a distinguished literary gossip. And then we'd have tea, and Paul would wake up and he would gently simulate some kind of pleasant remark, and then I would say, oh dear sir, I'm late for preparation, could you write me a note? And Millicent would say, Paul, write him a note. And so I'd go off to preparation. So my school days were a strange mixture of halcyon pleasures and rather shabby fears, because it was still the war and it was a military school, and I first put uniform on at the age of 12. And I think there hangs about me an atmosphere of decayed muskets, and dripping gaiters, and unravelled puttees. I remember when I went first on parade, still at the age of 12, the school corps was sort of lost in the First World War. It didn't get in the Second World War for a very long time. I don't know whether you know what puttees are, but they're kind of bandages which go around your leg up to just under the knee. And I suspect that they were really developed in the First World War for trench warfare. But anyhow, you wound them round and then hoped that they were going to stay up. Well, of course, when small boys tried to do that and were then told to march, they quickly unravelled. At the end of, the marching period, dozens of little boys stood in pools of unravelled puttees. But I could see some point in the military life nonetheless, because a lot of the schoolmasters, put on uniform once a week or whatever it was and drilled us, and some of them were perfectly nice people and indeed very, very civilized. Paul wrote a lot of books, you see, and he congregated round him some very gifted and splendid people. I mean, one of the boys who already left school before I arrived, but whom I met through Paul, was a young man called Lindsay Anderson. And Lindsay Anderson, as you know, has become a very, very distinguished film director, an actor, and was a brilliant person. In the school, which on the whole didn't contain all that many brilliant people. There was another schoolmaster there called Frank Halliday, who, with Paul's persuasion, gave up being a schoolmaster and became a Shakespeare factory. And wrote, the Shakespeare Dictionary, the Shakespeare Companion, an introduction to Shakespeare, Shakespeare and the Shakespeare Country, Shakespeare for every man for Shakespeare. And when he'd exhausted Shakespeare, he did the same thing for Thomas Hardy, as far as I can make out, and Cornwall. But, he had great literary leanings and was a very, very charming person. So the literary conversation, artistic conversation, well, Millicent said to me, why don't you draw? And I said, well, it was absurd. Artists are the laziest band as you could possibly imagine, but she persisted. About the age of 15, I suddenly began to be interested in the visual arts. 14 or 15, quite suddenly. Then there was a marvelous schoolmaster who taught art. And I can't describe him without the action, but he was a very dry man. I believe he's still alive. He must be 90 something. A very sweet man called Arthur Bell. Very dry person. And he used to refer to people. For instance, he'd talk about Rembrandt van Rijn, Rose mag Rembrandt van Rijn, and Hogarth, a great painter. Rose, I should warn you, the Impressionists, those fellows are rather dangerous. This was in 1940s. Impressionists are rather dangerous. Beware of the Impressionists. And he would like to be caught admiring an effect of light, shall we say, on a willow tree. And he would, the moment he saw this wonderful effect of light, he'd go, but when he actually had a brush, it was a very different matter. He'd go, his courage evaporated with the tool in his hand. I knew him well because he painted a portrait of me, very, very slowly, by an elaborate and antique procedure, which of course dated back to the days of the aforesaid Rembrandt van Rijn and Hogarth, and eschewed all the terrors and dangers of Impressionism. But he also added to my literary knowledge, because he used to say to me, have you read any of the novels of that great writer, Mr. Wells, Rose? Mr. Wells is a good writer. Mr. Galsworthy not quite so good. Mr. Wells, excellent. I should try Tono Bungay, perhaps, he would say. And, of course, his taste ran to English watercolours. So I learnt about English watercolours, amongst other things. He said, Rose, you may now use the school watercolour box, which was a very, very distinguished thing to be allowed to do, and it was a very, very old watercolour box with one whole brush in it. Well, it may not have been quite like that, but that's how I see dear Arthur Bell.
Were you regarded as one of the brilliant ones at that period?
Well, I was regarded, you see, as this terrible hirsute boy. And there was another brush between my mother and the headmaster when she said, don't you think he ought to go in and sit the scholarship exam for Cambridge? And the headmaster said, well, we don't really go in for that kind of thing at this school. The boys should not obtrude too much, and your son seems to obtrude quite enough in terms of whiskers. And she, of course, would then get back, but headmaster, how about education? So, I mean, I was the secretary of the school Shakespeare Reading Society, and that was where I learnt my great pleasure in reading Shakespeare. And then, of course, I was in the school plays, not terribly successfully much of the time. Great school player was a man called Nigel Davenport, who is now also a very distinguished actor. It was lovely to act with, because he really was really very, very good. And the master who produced, well, there were 2 or 3 masters who produced the plays. One was also a charming amateur singer, who was also a charming amateur watercolorist, a man called Davidson. A person of extraordinary polish and wore lovely suits. He was extremely kind and just the sort of person whom one felt one might like to be throughout one's life. Extremely kind, extremely intelligent, extremely well educated, and not more than appropriately ineffective. So I then went into the army, which of course one had to do, and then I'd gone up to Cambridge to sit the scholarship examination. That was really in its own way rather wonderful, because it was in December, and I sampled great joys of travelling with a little money in my pocket to this frightening combat by fast and chuffy trains through a snowy landscape. It was my first experience of having breakfast by myself as a grown-up young man and watching the frosty ground slide past and eyeing a somewhat comatose egg and the rather thick china of the Great Western Railways, because they hadn't been nationalised at that stage. I don't know whether you know about China, railway China. It's about 3 times as thick as anybody else. Just in case, I think, you take a bite out of it, when there's a jolt in the train. And then in London I met my father, and he took me to an appalling restaurant, which was one of the few German restaurants in London which survived during the Second World War. Food was ghastly. And then he said, well, here's a note for Eric Heller when you get to Cambridge, and here's another note for Francis Bennett when you get to Cambridge. So I felt well provided with these little chits, letters of introduction. I knew I was going to be safe when I got that. And indeed, while Francis Bennett was busy, Eric Heller was not busy, and invited me out to a lovely, absolutely grown-up dinner at Miller's wine bar. Asked me to survey the wine list, a thing I'd never seen before in my life, and gave me a tremendous fear, which I've never overcome. And then dining in King's College and seeing the extraordinary beautiful architecture. It was a sunny morning. There was another boy from my school called Bishop, who became an architect and had a very severe lisp. And together we looked under the opening eyelids of the dawn. We looked at the great fane of King's College Chapel, unwreathing from the mists that rise from the Cambridgeshire fens. And it was so, so beautiful and extraordinary. And then the people were so extremely kind. And they looked at one eagerly and asked one, they fed one the most beautiful questions, like, you were fond of 18th century novels? Yes, you are fond of 18th century novels. Well, yes, I'm very fond of 18th century novels too, yes. Well, we're both fond of 18th century novels. Tell me a little bit more, my dear boy, about 18th century novels. Are you fond of Fielding? Yes, I'm very fond of Fielding. Well, I'm very fond of Fielding too. Yes, well, tell us a little bit more, yes. Well, are you fond of Tom Jones? Well, no, not Tom Jones so much, sir. No, well, Josie Van, yes, sir, and Pamela, oh yes, Pamela, yes, what other novel? And it bubbled away. And then there was this strange and extraordinary man, who was very difficult for anybody quite to do justice to, because in some ways he's a very menacing and dreadful person. In other ways he's very, very gifted. And he was an old man of the mountain who was provost of the college at that time, and he was a tremendous poseur. And he had that white hair. And it said that his hair went white the night he heard of the death of Rupert Brooke. It's that kind of thing. And he had beautiful, beautiful boots, which laced up, all very, very carefully laced up. And he'd sit in a deep sofa, and you'd see all the lacing on his boots, and you'd see the beginning of his combinations. So it would be fascinating to get this deep, intimate glimpse of the real him. He was a sentimentalist of the first water. He was also extremely cruel, because he had all these boys, you see, seated in this big circle round a rather exiguous fire in Provost Lodge. And he'd go round each one and he'd say, yes, dear boy, and what's your name? And somebody would say, Moberly. He said, oh yes, well done, Moberly, very good. And what school do you come from? Oh, Eton, yes, our sister college, yes, excellent, yes. And what's your name, boy? And, you know, I mean, well, it came to a poor boy who suffered under two appallingly, and I suspect, mutually enhancing disadvantages. He had a stammer and a perfectly impossible name for a schoolboy. And Shepherd somehow already gasped. So he then formed particular enthusiastic friendliness and glee. He said, bless you, dear boy. And what is your dear name? And the boy went, wop, 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 wop. And Shepherd said, yes, bless you, dear boy. Wetter, sir. Of course, I mean, Wetter's the most terrible boy, name for a boy. I mean, you know, short of being corny, I had two students in this last class who had even worse names. One was called Moron, but I suppose he pronounced it Moron. And the other was called Twaddle. Now, no boy could ever survive in England whose name was Twaddle. I mean, you know, you could survive in California if your name was Twaddle, but you couldn't possibly survive with a name called Twaddle. I mean, you have to change by deed poem. Now, there was this poor boy with his name Wetter and the stammer, and Shepherd was just infernally cruel. He said, bless you, well done, very well done indeed, that's admirable. But I didn't quite hear. Oh, again. And he did that 3 times. And then he talked in sentimental fashion about the founder of the college, Henry VI, the boy founder, and how, you know, when everybody else had gone, he was left playing in the chapel. So that Shepherd was a very, very curious and fascinating mixture of the malign and the tender, the grotesque and the clamantly piercing. Because he had a very good mind, which had been wasted on these strange, miscellaneous, sadistic, and yet fine forays. Very odd person. And there it was, you see. I mean, well, suddenly was with all these people, with all their quirks and their oddities and their enthusiasms. And King's College was a special college in 2 or 3 ways. One, it had this, you know, it had the greatest piece of architecture in Cambridge, and in some ways, one of the 2 or 3 greatest pieces of architecture in England, and of its kind, you know, the greatest piece of architecture in the world. I mean, there is no greater example of fan vaulting than that in King's Chapel. I mean, the Henry VII Chapel in Westminster is very ugly by comparison, and the stuff at Peterborough is insignificant, and the stuff at Canterbury, which I've never seen, is obviously not as important. Anyhow, so there's that aspect. And then there were these wonderful professors, and they had a very special tradition, which went back to Shepherd's own mentor, who was a man called Oscar Browning. And Oscar Browning was a person of what used to be called somewhat dubious morals. That is to say, he was probably much fonder of young men than he was of women of any age. And there had been a sort of scandal at Eton, and then he'd come to King's, taught history for 40 to 45 years, and it's described in a wonderful way. One of his pupils once described it, said, well, I went to the first lecture, and Oscar B. said, brought in a huge pile of books, and he said, this is Flumph, and this is Grumph, and this is Schrumpf, and this is Plumph, and this is Grumple, and this is Schnumple. If any of you read any of these books, I advise you not to bother with my lectures, because we're going to examine these books, and if you know them already, don't bother. But do come and have tea, dear boys, instead. And Oscar Browning would then invite undergraduates to tea, and you meet a cabinet minister, or you meet, one of those Ruritanian noblemen or royals that used to frequent the world before the First World War, and maybe a composer, and Oscar Brown himself would be playing the piano in one corner, and there'd be guardsmen discussing military tactics in another corner, so that there was a great social living. And there's a wonderful story of Oscar Browning when some foreign royalty had come to visit. He lived at the top of the tremendous high building, and OB had a crimson carpet laid from the front gate of the college right through to his rooms, and was seen bowing and genuflecting all the way while the royalty came, and there was OB sort of bowing. It must have been such a wonderful sight from behind. Make a great film. But the tradition, you see, of being very kind to the young was an old tradition, and much kept up when I was an undergraduate, so it was not the least scrap surprising to be invited out to sherry parties and out to dinner parties by the professors. I mean, you took that for granted. And I happened to come up at a peculiar moment. Most of the ex-servicemen had gone down. The war ex-servicemen had gone down. And, you know, the peace boys had really fully come up. We were old enough, you know, to have been under the shadow of the war, but not to have taken part in it. So we belonged to a very peculiar period. And a lot of us were very concerned with the aesthetic work and the literary work. And for instance, there was Simon Raven, who was somewhat my senior, about a year or two earlier than myself. And he looked like a kind of glorious but slightly mangy lion. And he had seen wine lists since he was about 2 years old. He'd not really seen the wine list, he'd imbibed deeply of the blushing Hippocrene, and was a tremendous wine snob. And I remember once going to call on him in his room when I was still very, very young, you know, and didn't know anything about it. He said, "Oh, do come in, Jasper. How lovely to see you. Yes, well, I'm drinking green chartreuse, but I don't seem to have any more glasses, so you'll have to make do with a tooth mug." So I drank the most expensive of all liqueurs out of a Bakelite cup. And Simon was nothing if not sort of crudely and happily generous. I was given a whole tooth mug full of green chartreuse. It took me 2 hours to gradually make my way to the bottom and see, you know, the rather unpleasant remains of the brushing of teeth down at the bottom of it. But he was a person of unbridled interest in the seamier side of life. Was always telling stories about his escapades with boys and girls, and he made a great point that the escapades were sort of absolutely even-handed. And I think he thought of himself as a sort of post-Second War Evelyn Waugh. And his novels, of which he's written a great many, sort of oscillate between Evelyn Waugh and Ronald Furbank and Anthony Powell, and are full of flashes of splendor and then flashes of facetiousness, and largely speaking about the antics of people who never have existed and who behave with a kind of schoolboy sense of honor, fabulously badly but fabulously interestingly. And that's how he wanted to lead his life. Well, I can zero in a little bit more on him by telling you how he was a scholar of the college, and he was very good at classics. And the college decided that he could go on and be a research student for a while, because though he borrowed a good deal of money from many of the fellows, it was really comparatively small sums, and they didn't feel too jaded about it. But as a research student, as distinct from undergraduate, though he maintained his scholarship, he wasn't, to his intense disgust and astonishment, he wasn't invited to Founders' Feast, which was a great feast in December, where all the scholars on the foundation were invited, and sundry other people, and you had an enormous and wonderful dinner, and then you listened to speeches by Sir Edward Boyle, or Lord Burkitt, or Hugh Gateskill, or somebody like that. I can't remember who they were, but you know, grandees, and then you got gloriously and thoroughly and totally drunk. And so Simon decided to hold his own rival party, which he did at the Pitt Club, which was a conservative undergraduate club. See, he borrowed my smoking jacket, And he went off to the pit club and he had to get small dinner for 4, and the bill came to £18 with another £15 for breakages. And he arrived suitably drunk after dinner to do his round of rooms, because after dinner, you know, after he drank all these toasts and heard all these speeches and got very drunk, we were then invited to half a dozen professors' Don's rooms where we could get more drunk. The provost would entertain, and that would be all right, and the vice provost would entertain, and then 3 or 4 or 5 really extremely joke-kind professors would entertain. There was Simon, rocking on his feet, clenching his teeth, because he knew that if he unclenched his teeth, it would all spill out of him. And you know, longing to say some cutting remark, but not quite, and then being given brandy in a beer tankard, which finally did for him. I didn't get my smoking jacket back for quite a time because it had to go to the cleaners. And you see, really Simon was a figure totally out of the 18th century, a Rowlandson person, and you know, somebody whom you could be prepared for by the novels of Smollett, I suppose, even more than Fielding. But interestingly enough, my wife always found him the most sweet and courteous and delightful person. Had great magnetism and charm. And when his debts became too severe for the college to countenance him any longer, they said, "Simon, my dear boy, there's only one thing for you to do. You better go into the army, because the army looks after its own, and the debt collectors won't harass you quite so much there." So he went into the army. We used to ask his brother officers what they thought of Simon. "Oh," they said, "hey, the professor! Ha yes, he's a very jolly chap. Bit naive though, isn't he? Doesn't seem to know his way about life, does he?"
What subject did you study then?
Well, you must understand that English universities, particularly the ancient universities, particularly in those days, you tended to study one subject when you read a particular subject. There were a few exceptions to that. At Oxford there was a thing called PPE, which was politics, philosophy and economics, which I think was a very good thing, and should be encouraged actually in American universities, because it's a good combination. I read history, and it meant, you know, for 3 years I put my nose into great big folios. I'd read old worm-eaten calf volumes, and it was a nice easy study in many ways, because the dons were friendly, and one would go perhaps to 1 or 2 lectures a week in the autumn quarter in Michaelmas term, and then one's enthusiasm would peter out a little bit, and you know, in the depths of the winter when the rain wasn't very nice, one would perhaps go to 1 lecture a week, and then, you know, in the spring one was preparing for examinations. Unless somebody very interesting was going, one might not go to any lectures at all. And then there'd be a weekly tutorial, and they were very variegated. I was taught partly by a man called Noel Annan, who became very distinguished senior university administrator and pundit, and now sits in the House of Peers. And you would go to Noel, who gleamed all over, gloriously. He was bald and braced, and wore camel hair overcoats and double-breasted waistcoats, and was already obviously set upon a path of such upward mobility that you couldn't even see him from time to time. He was streaming into the azure so splendidly, and he would say, "Oh, my dear boy, do come in. Well, wonderful. Yes. Oh, you've been writing about St. Augustine. Yes, a very difficult topic. Yes, well, all right. Yes, well, all right, I'll read your paper. Perhaps we should fortify ourselves with a glass of sherry. Oh, dear. Well, no, this won't do at all, Jasper. It really won't do. I mean, you know, the fact is that Augustine believed in original sin, my dear boy. But, well, no, if you care to read the second paragraph, you see, that's just what I'm going to say. Well, I don't think we read any more of this. I mean, it's obvious you understand Augustine. Yes, well, what do you really think of Martin? Do you think he's getting all right? He's a very curious boy, isn't he? And so, I mean, and it could be anything. I mean, we talk about it. It could be a personal scandal, it could be Cardinal Newman, it could be whatever would come up about it. Oh, do tell me some more about those Victorian novels you've always been reading by Delphine. What should I read? I mean, why do you like Thackeray? I mean, sir, dreadful. I mean, really bad writer. Well, you defend that. Go on, defend it. I mean, that won't do. Those very lively and stimulating. And then, contrast with him was John Saltmarsh, who died some time ago, who was a very eccentric person. And he would greet you perhaps at the door of his room saying, "Oh, come along in, dear fellow. Won't you sit down? Yes. Yes, I notice you're looking at my feet. Yes, I'm not wearing socks today. No, I've been going through my socks, and I find a very alarming thing. I have 96 pairs of socks, all of them with holes in them. So, what have you been reading? Oh, yes. Well, you were reading him last week. Yes, well, he's not all that long, but I suppose he will spin out for 2 weeks, won't he? Yes, well, perhaps you might give me your paper." And then, and your paper. Well, I played a little game with John Saltmarsh. I've become very, 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 very preoccupied with my handwriting, which is very ugly. When I was a schoolboy, and I was always being told off for being untidy and so on. And so I went through a number of reforms. I never was taught calligraphy, but I became fascinated, particularly when I saw an exhibition of literary people's handwriting. So I started reforming my handwriting, and I could get it very, very small indeed. And so I used to get these sheets of unlined paper, and I would see how many words I could get on a line. You can get as few as 6 or 3 or 4 if you're idle, but you can get them in about sort of 45. You're really very small. And I would watch John reading very carefully and slowly across the line. When you know what was going to happen, it took him rather a long time, so he'd forgotten what the other side of the page looked like by the time he got over there. And when he got to the other end, he didn't know which line to land on, and he'd land on the wrong line. He'd get a little way across, and then he'd realise that he hadn't landed on the right line, so he'd go back and take him forever to read my essay. Perfectly legible, but it was just that difficult. So he would go on, and very quietly he would read, and the Jasper would go. Then he said, "Oh, do smoke if you want to." And I would sometimes smoke and sometimes not smoke. And then eventually he'd say, "Yes." He'd get to the end of it and say, "Yes, I think so. Yes, I think so. Yes, yes, I do think so. Yes, yes. Well, of course, the abbot was a man of the world, you see. Yes, so I think so. Yes, yes. What are you going to do next week?" And that was his comment on your paper. And you would say, "Well, I think I might do something on the partition of Poland." And he'd say, "Well, yes, I think so. Yes, now why not? Yes, good subject. Partition of Poland. Yes." I mean, he was so remote and so extraordinary. It worked incredibly hard for him. I mean, you put everything into these essays. I mean, apart from playing a little game about landing on the right line, and at the same time, you realise he was exceedingly learned. And that, "Yes, I think so," was words of high praise. What he said to people who didn't write good papers. I mean, do you suppose he said, "Well, I don't think so. No, I don't quite think so. No."
Were they all extraordinary?
Well, many of them, I mean, yes, I think you have to say that many of them were rather extraordinary for a very, very simple reason. King's itself had gone through a very dreadful period. It was a royal foundation. It had this enormous chapel. It had a beautiful building built on in the 18th century called the Gibbs Building, where eventually I had my rooms when I was a fellow. It then had a large range of early 19th century buildings done by Wilkins, including a very large dining hall. Carl Pearson, who was sent there in the late 1850s, described it as being very extraordinary, because there in this huge dining hall, which would hold 250 in the main body as a distinct place, it would hold another 70 or 80 on the days. There were 13 undergraduates. What had happened, that because it was a royal foundation, people who wanted to do well didn't go to it, because as a royal foundation, the scholars of King's all came from Eton. It was closed. Only Etonians could go to King's. And furthermore, they could proceed to their BA without taking any kind of exam whatsoever. And from their BA, they automatically could get a fellowship if they wanted. In the early 19th century, I think there were about 5 or 6 fellows with the surname Thackeray. And it's clear that the Thackeray's had got a big grip on the place. And at one stage, the provost and the vice provost were called Thackeray. So, you could see how that might discourage bright people. And before the university reforms of the middle of the century, King's was a very, very isolated college. Austin Lee and one or two other people were, I think, responsible for leading the reform of the university, leading the reform of the college, and then doing something which is very extraordinary, and which I've always tried to persuade people at UCSC should be done and would make the most intense difference to UCSC. The fellows of the college, i.e. professors, said, we've got to do something about this place. You know, we have largish, or reasonably large endowments, or we don't have much money. But clearly, unless we set up scholarships for boys from other places than Eton, we're never going to become a great college again. So what we're going to do is we're going to hand back half of our annual dividends, because they were paid through an annual dividend, which at that stage was probably about £300. And so they agreed to hand back £150 each in order to set up a fund for scholarships. And by 1900, the college had become very, very distinguished. And lots of very great people came. Roger Fry was a Kingsman. Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson was a Kingsman. Arthur Cecil Pigou was a Kingsman. And of course, John Maynard Keynes was a Kingsman. And that's formed a lot of names. I mean, there were many others, less distinguished, less well known. And of course, administrations of WEG, of OB, were very important in improving the total atmosphere. So by an act of gentle self-sacrifice, King's was pulled out of the rut and became a very distinguished college. But that, of course, was only part of it. Another part of it was simply that Oxford and Cambridge were smallish institutions, who I suppose about 17,000 undergraduates between the two of them. There were very few other English universities, and the other English universities were in a separate category. I mean, they were called the provincial universities or the red brick universities. And because there were systems of scholarship, a lot of poor children came, as well as a lot of wealthy children. There was still a lot of privilege, but there were also young men from Wigan, or Wiggleston, or Warrington, or Hull, or Leeds, or Liverpool, or the London suburbs, who were determined to make their mark. So that the undergraduates were a remarkable lot, and the professors were a remarkable lot. One of the things which I think, again, is very, very important to realise is that many of the professors, or a substantial group of professors, had private incomes. And of course that gave them a very different attitude. If they didn't like something, they said, well, I'm not going to put up with that. Don't be silly. Of course we're not going to do that. The colleges themselves had a considerable degree of autonomy, and within the college a considerable degree of democracy. I can explain this to you very simply by talking about what happened on wine nights. On wine nights, after dinner, which you had free, whether you were married or single, you went into the wine room, or the combination room, wine room, and you sit down and you drink port, or dessert claret, or dessert sherry, and you then, cigars would be handed round, and coffee, and then the party would break up, And the perquisite, in King's, the perquisite of the junior fellow was the undrunk portion of the claret, because of course claret wouldn't keep, and the junior fellow was supposed to be hard up. But very often, of course, the junior fellow was a very distinguished professor. But distinguished professor, or blithe 22, 23-year-old, didn't matter. The junior fellow, whoever he was, got the claret, and sometimes the claret was therefore given to a wizened, white-haired old boy. I can remember the first time, well, not the first time, it can't be the first time. I remember one of the early times when the distinguished Professor Meyer Forties, who was a William Wickham Wise Professor of Anthropology, of Social Anthropology, and who thought of himself as a great gun, was the junior fellow. And there he was with the claret.
What about art? Did you study art?
Well, art was a very different kind of world. I mean, you've got to remember that art really, I mean, Roger Fry was an undergraduate at King's, but as indeed was E.M. Forster. But the visual arts, on the one hand, Milner White, who was dean of the college, was a great collector and was one of the first people in England to collect modern British ceramics. He became Dean of York and gloriously beautified York Minster and left a very important bequest to the City Museum of York. But that was a sporadic affair. Art was certainly not part of the university curriculum, and I don't know that it is even to this day. King's College eventually had a fellow in painting because they became more and more vain. The college became very vain, I think, wanted to patronise everything. And Maynard Keynes made an enormous amount of money for the college, so they wanted to spend it in this way, that way, the other way. But there were no, I mean, you couldn't take a degree in painting. There was an architecture school which languished until the middle of the 50s when a man called Leslie Martin came and brushed it up. There was a great university gallery called the Fitzwilliam. But the Fitzwilliam stopped, I mean, Picasso was hardly thought of. There was a splendid old boy called Captain S.W. Sykes who made a lot of money in Newmarket, punting on the races for his room, and he collected impressions. And as a young man, I sold him a painting. But on the whole, the art world, the world of art and the world of the university, entirely separate. And indeed, I think it's almost bound to be so, and I don't think it really, many universities in England now have art departments. The activity of painting is so unlike the activity of reading for a degree in sociology. Mind you, of course, when I was an undergraduate, there was no sociology in Cambridge. I well remember the famous debate that took place amongst the Fellows of King's in one of the congregations, when the college, as a very advanced college, thought we King's might lead the way and prompt the university to establish sociology by offering a fellowship in sociology. And the debate was very, very interesting. And a number of fellows, I can't remember exactly who they were, got up and said, this sociology, I mean, it's rubbish, doesn't it? I mean, have you ever read a good sociological book? No, of course I haven't. I mean, you know perfectly well it's just a really rather harmful mush. And I don't think King's College should have anything to do with it. We have a very distinguished psychologist, Professor Oliver Zangwill, and surely that is enough of that kind of thing. With all due respect to you, Oliver. Then the other said, but we really must try to keep abreast of the time. It's an important subject, many, many interesting things, and I, speaking as a social anthropologist, I would have to say that I rather take offence at some of these remarks, and I would have thought that if social anthropology is countenanced in the University of Cambridge, King's College should set the lead in sociology proper, because it is after all, and let us point out that in fact this country is lagging behind economically in many other ways, and we do need to understand what is going on in Britain and the world at large. Then somebody said, whom are we going to advertise for? And one fellow said, well, I think we restrict the advertisement to graduates of King's College, should we not?
Someone said, well, how are we going to have a sociologist amongst them? A sociologist has never been taught in King's. Well, that's just the point, my dear sir. We would have somebody who has come to sociology from the outside and is therefore duly and properly sceptical of that subject. Well, they thought, well, it wouldn't be quite so close, but they restricted to graduates holding a degree from the University of Oxford, first degree from the University of Oxford or Cambridge. They couldn't find anybody. They couldn't find anybody who satisfied them because the fellowship electors were wanting a real sociologist, whereas the body of the fellows weren't wanting a real sociologist. So a year went by and nobody could be found, and then they opened it up and then they got indeed a sociologist. But you can see if sociology is hardly in the University of Cambridge, why should painting be in the University of Cambridge? Instead there was Cambridge School of Art, which was a totally separate institution, which had been founded as long ago as Ruskin, and where a few enterprising young shavers like myself went to do life drawing. And we did life drawing. And I can remember that so well. Because you must remember that English childhood was somewhat protected. And I was, I suppose, 19, nearly 20 at the time. And I got such a shock when I first saw an unclothed young woman. I couldn't believe it. It seemed to me not to correspond to anything I'd ever learnt from statuary or painting. I looked eagerly at statuary, and I looked eagerly at painting, but the real thing seemed to me absolutely different. And I could not come to terms with it at all well. She was, in fact, I think, perfectly ordinary young person, but I thought, well, this isn't right. That shouldn't be there, and that shouldn't be there. Do I have to draw it? And an elderly sculptor was taking this evening class, and he stood behind me. And he said nothing else, so went away. So I waited till he stood behind me again, and I sort of looked round, and he went, So I wasn't very successful, and I dropped it after about 3 weeks. But during the course of that 3 weeks, I discovered a young lady art student who was extremely charming, agreeable, so I carried on my researches in very different form. But I was already painting a good deal by then, and indeed I was already exhibiting by that stage. And there was a young man who's now no longer a young man at all, who was a distinguished elder of British art, who was running a thing called the Heifer Gallery. And I'd met a very charming woman who was a keen painter, who'd been married to a military man and had a very difficult life of it. She showed some of my work to him, and before I knew where it was, there it was exhibited. And he sold some of my work when I was very young, and it was very, very encouraging. It was a kind of false dawn, really.
These watercolors, Jasper?
Well, there were watercolors and then there were oils. But it was difficult because it meant that by the time I got to a BA, there I was, a sort of historian of sorts, a painter of sorts, and it was very difficult to see how I should mix those two things together. And the rest of my life has been an awkward conflict. As a boy, I wanted to become a novelist. I was quite convinced that I should become a novelist. I tried, and I wrote bits of novels, and I wrote short stories, but nothing seemed to emerge, whereas, you know, I did these paintings and they were snatched away from me. On the other hand, it was also very clear that I wasn't easily going to make a living, and my parents said, no, you don't have to do. My father said, painting is a very good hobby, isn't it? You know that? Painting is a very good hobby. Very good hobby is painting, isn't it? And so people said to me, you know, that my mentor said to me, well, you may be a good painter, but we don't know whether you're really a good painter, but we can tell you're a pretty good historian, so if you stick to the history, you should be perfectly all right. So it was a natural kind of conflict. Now, does all this, I mean, is that enough?
Well, can we stop now and see where we are?
Well, I mean, I've come to the end, my dear.
The Cambridge Review, I think.
Oh, well, I mean, that's yeah, but I mean, you know, you can't want to know. I mean, more, I mean, I've told you everything, haven't I? Just about
What about your
almost.
acting? Did you give up your acting when you went to Cambridge?
Well, yes, I gave it up. I occasionally used to appear to sing a song or two, because I was one of the very few people who played the guitar in those days. And I affected a light tenor voice. And I was also one of the very few people who sang Elizabethan love songs in those days. It was not a period for Elizabethan love songs. So they, you know, when they did a Shakespeare thing, they would say, oh, well, could you just come along and sing Sigh No More Ladies, or When Laura Smiles, or something like that, which suited me because it meant there were no rehearsals. And I mean, it's a very interesting thing about Cambridge acting. There was no drama department in Cambridge. And I don't think there's a drama department to this day in Cambridge. On the other hand, as you know, the British theatre is almost entirely dominated by Cambridge, even more than Oxford people. And you have to realise that the theory of education was so totally different. You were not pressed to go to lectures all the time. Indeed, you were the terms were really quite short. You had term, and then you had full term. Now, term meant that you could go up to Cambridge, let's say about, the 1st of October. But nothing actually happened very much except parties and reading and pleasant intercommunication and delightful times and walks and so on, until about the 10th of October, when full term started. And full term only lasted 8 weeks, you see. So that full term would end at the beginning of December, and then there would be the rest of term, when, you know, you relaxed and you had more parties, and, well, of course you had parties during the course of the term. And generally speaking, it was thought that most of the work you did, particularly in the humanities, you would do during the vacations. I mean, because we found you busy during term time to do much reading back in Paris. You were given a lot of leisure, and I think that's one of the most important things, which is almost it's totally disappeared from American education. It seems to me that the one thing that students are not protected towards is having time to read on their own. Not to read, you know, for a class, but to read whatever it is that's interesting them. And of course, you just simply presuppose that these young men and young women would not waste their time reading sociology or that kind of thing. They'd read things that matter. And they were very well educated before they arrived, so there was a completely different feeling of leisure, which made it very possible for me, for instance, to spend a lot of time painting. Made it very possible for boys and girls who wanted to play cricket, which is the most time-absorbing game you could possibly imagine. I mean, look, a cricket match lasts 3 days. You start at 11, you end at 6:30. And the young men who played for the University of Cambridge would play 2 matches a week, perhaps, most weeks at the spring, during the spring quarter. And then they'd have to prepare for examination, where it was recognised, you know, that for almost any purpose, it was more important to have won your Cambridge Blue than to have done well in the examinations. But there were many cases where a young man would bowl out the Australians and then go and win a double first and do very, very well in these examinations. The point being that the level at which you expected to perform was really quite advanced and sophisticated. It wasn't, the dour business of just committing rubbish to memory and regurgitating it. You had really been very well educated. And it meant, you see, that you had plenty of time for the theatre. You didn't, if you wanted to be in the Marlowe Society, which was the most distinguished acting group, it was expected that about a third of the people who acted in the marvelous society would get firsts, and then the others would do rather bad. But you didn't do that. So that there was a kind of eager, high-spirited amateur quality about them, which was very, very important, and a kind of freedom in the way that people did act. But I didn't act because, along with the freedom, there's a good deal of competition, I felt. And also, King's was a great centre of actors. And I used to meet them, that crowd, at breakfast. And I simply could not stomach the kind of conversation. Oh, my darling little dame, she was just so wonderful yesterday evening. And she's just such a marvellous old bag, isn't she? I mean, don't you notice the way she, I mean, wonderful way, but I really don't you think she's any good at that? I mean, did you talk to her about it? And I just thought, the amount of name dropping and the silliness of so much of the conversation, I thought, no, I couldn't possibly, I don't want to go in that direction. I suppose also I wasn't really totally confident about my acting ability. Indeed, it's another thing which one has to realise, and that is that, in an English public school, you might be very, very gifted, you might seem to be wonderfully ahead of everybody else. When you got to Cambridge, you realised that people like you were to a penny. I mean, it was such a congregation. And I always used to argue that one of the things which really wasn't quite good about the English system was the intensely narrowing effect of the elitism. That is to say, how competitive examinations would bring such brilliant galaxies to Cambridge and Oxford, where my theory was that they rubbed a little bit of the nap off each other. And they discouraged each other. I mean, in some ways, of course, being with other brilliant people is very helpful and pleasant and lovely. But too much of it, and you can get profoundly discouraged. And as you know, almost every year there'll be a couple of suicides around the examination time. Really quite different from the sort of suicide you get on here. And they usually be of young men who felt that they'd made a mistake in their examinations. And then what would be said, oh, well, but the papers are wonderful, he was due to get a first, But the atmosphere of intense competitivity really are fundamentally, I think, awful, a great mistake. And it was competitivity of the wrong kind, and there was no spirit of cooperation that went with it. And in some ways, while it makes English academics often formidable and very, very able, it also, I think, makes them rather short-winded in certain respects and remote from life's ordinary concerns. And you could argue that this intense, narrow funneling of an elite has robbed the English life of a certain kind of robustness. And it's full of private jokes. And one of the great worries, I suppose, in the United States is that group of American people who are fascinated by culture, who, in particular in the literary field, have to know their inner English world. And it's etiolated. It lacks certain kind of vigor, lacks certain kind of charity and sweetness, ultimately.
I'm afraid we're exhausting you. Could you say just one or two words about the Cambridge Review?
Well, the Cambridge Review was sort of an odd thing, really, because it had fallen on rather curious days. I mean, it originated in the end of the 1870s, and amongst the early people who contributed to it were people like Sir J.G. Fraser, who of course wasn't an anthropologist, but was a classic stuff. And it dragged its length along. There was an Oxford counterpart, which
which I think was called the Oxford Magazine, and it was, amongst other things, a sort of general learned review. These journals were concerned primarily, I suppose, with two things. They were concerned with university politics, and they were concerned with the larger world of scholarship. And in that way they functioned rather importantly. That is to say, they reviewed a wide range of scholarly books for the well-educated. The New York Review of Books, is not quite the same. It's a little more popular in its point of view, and it tends to draw its contributors from a rather flashier, narrower group. The Cambridge Review at its best would use scholars of possibly deeper learning and less obviously seductive literary talents to make substantial reviews. It of course helped when it was going well. It helped to provide a public opinion in the university and helped to keep some kind of finger on the pulse of what was happening in the intellectual world. It was therefore really rather important. I achieved a certain notoriety, I suppose, in it because it was lagging in the late 1950s. They made a number of very, very foolish decisions about distribution. And one of the things where some foolish editor would say, we want the dons to buy this paper, so we're not going, please don't take it in the common rooms. And that seemed to me absolutely the most stupid thing to do. So I said, we sent around a note saying, would every common room take it? The moment every common room took it, the circulation went up. We doubled the circulation in a year, and we took up a number of rather controversial subjects. We took up the subject of compulsory Latin, which was a very interesting one. The scientists felt that they were being inhibited from getting very good schoolboys and schoolgirls coming to Oxford and Cambridge because you had, in order to matriculate, you had to take an examination in Latin. They said, with all their science, we can't do this. And what is the purpose of learning this dead language? We'll have to do English and this and that, the other modern language. Aren't the days of the classics over? That was a major controversy which we ran. And it led to the abolition of the Latin requirement at Cambridge. A matter which I'm now no longer really quite so happy about. My co-editor was a scientist and was more determined than I was in that direction, so I can shove a little of the blame on him. And then there was a great sociology debate, which, all sorts of people from America got involved in. George Homan's, for instance, Sol Tax, I think. Ed Shills, a whole lot of Americans said, well, now we've got them on, we'll smite them hip and thigh, and they contributed. So that it became what a good sort of local magazine should become. It became, largely speaking, correspondence column. And then we ran a controversy, of course, about general entrance to the university and what to do about the tendency of towards extreme elitism. And then we also ran a splendid attack on some Cambridge architecture, some new Cambridge architecture, which I think had everybody amused. In every editorial, there was a reference to it, and that amused people. It was a rather schoolboy kind of pranky sort of thing to do. But the uglies, or the anti-uglies, came down from London, and I think it was one of almost their first march was on a new building at Emmanuel College, which we'd christened Emmanuel's ghastly new building, which was then shortened to EGNB. And that was a sort of funny mixture. But you never knew who was going to write for it, and you might manage to squeeze a teeny little something out of E.M. Forster, for instance, who was in residence at the time. I enjoyed doing that, and it sort of ministered to my tendencies as an impresario, I think.
Well, it was really a marvelous magazine journal. I guess for many years I still do have the idea that the term Cowell Review back to me again and again. And
Oh yes.
think,
Well,
how
I mean,
you-
in a slightly larger sense, it would have paid the University of California to have started a California review, because just on the West Coast there's an enormously powerful, variegated group of scholars, and they could have done themselves a lot of good, and they could have done the world of learning at large a lot of good by creating a view which drew on those resources and helped to pull an intellectual life together in California, which doesn't really exist and should exist. There are a lot of very, very talented people, and the point was that when you wrote for the Cambridge Review, you weren't paid, but it was a wonderful way of publishing. It was particularly good for, I was very lucky, there I was 28 or something when I first edited it. I then was able to write to anybody I liked in the academic world, say, would you please review such and such a book, or we're thinking of an article about deep sea fishing, or we're thinking of an article about the contemporary state of Assyriological studies, or should there be a new campus at the University of Sussex. I mean, wonderful wide variety of topics, bring you in touch, and I could then ask young people to write reviews, and they would gain experience. I myself wrote a lot of art reviews for the Cambridge Review, and that gave me a lot of experience in the realm of art reviewing. It meant that a little later I was invited to write art reviews for a London magazine. So, in the University of California it would function in many different ways, extremely useful. And of course it wasn't expensive. It was very, very cheap to run. We made a loss of about 3 pennies on each copy we sold, so which was one of the reasons why nobody wanted the circulation to improve, because you went up from 600 and you were losing about £15 an issue. You went up to 1,200 and you, for the time being, were losing twice as much. Of course, that wasn't permanently true, because as it revived somewhat, publishers were more ready to advertise it, and most of the revenue came from advertisement. And in fact, I don't think there's any doubt that a lot of American publishers would back such a thing really quite eagerly if it became the weekly, and this is another interesting thing, as a weekly thing. That's the trouble. Almost all academic journals appear, 4 times a year? Well, you're never going to get a correspondence column going if you wait 3 months before. But I protest, sir. The Reverend Professor Snapdrankle got all his references wrong. For 3 months, you're not going to write about that unless it's going to come out. So you can. Well, one of the exciting things was it quickened the temperature of controversy, and one of the great troubles of American universities is they don't have controversy. They don't know how to deal with controversy. They have none of the correct manners, attitudes for dealing with a controversial subject. And they can't, therefore, when somebody says something sharp, everybody trembles and falls into rages and difficulties. It's very important. It's a very important thing.
Just in the very few remaining minutes, I think they're even less than 10, would you say a few words about how you happened to come to the United States? Why were you interested in coming?
Well, of course, I wasn't really scrap interested in coming. It was a chapter of very strange accidents. I found myself getting less and less interested in history in the late 1950s, and more interested in painting. I began to teach in a very accidental way. I even began to teach painting a little bit, though I'd never myself been to an art school. I'd never really been taught any painting. I had a fellowship at King's, but it was going to run out. And I didn't think that I wanted to go through the business of trying to get it extenuated any further. It had been extenuated long enough. I had to live in Cambridge for a bit because my elder son had a problem with his feet, and it was desirable for it to be looked after by the same doctor for a while. So I had to look for another job. And I managed to wangle my way into the Cambridge School of Art. They were delighted to have me because I was, I was a snobbish property, so to speak. And I knew how to teach painting, I knew how to paint, and I knew a good deal of history, so obviously I could teach art history. And that's how I came to teach art history. I mean, not because I went to about 2 art history lectures before I started giving lectures. It's really the best way, because then you actually give your own lectures. You don't actually give somebody else's lectures with frills. And then I wasn't enjoying it quite as much, because I had a series of disagreements with the head of the school. And about that time, a dear stammery friend of mine, who was a mathematician, economist, a statistician, who was of North African origin, was a very, 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 very shy person indeed, very sweet, suddenly rose up in the summer, raised his eyebrows and said, do you think that I'm going to Rice, he said. So I said, yes. I mean, he might as well have said, I'm going to seed or something, or I'm going to dogs, but yes, it's a Rice Institute. Nice, rice, nice rice. So I said, well done, Sam. I'm glad that fortune is smiling on you. So he said, well, I think it probably is. I've been at, I've forgotten whether it was Yale or Harvard or Columbia or something like that. So I'm moving on. He said, well, I think it's going to be rather nice. He said, perhaps, do you think you might like to come? So I said, well, why not? I thought, well, that's all I'll ever hear of it, because Sam is hardly a sort of, an entrepreneur, impresario type. He was just being sweet. And he said, would you like to see my new car? Yes, I drive now. And I thought nothing of it. And then about sort of in November or something like that, I got a letter from him saying, I'm making you interested in rices. Very nice, very nice. You might really quite enjoy rice. A lot to be said for rices. Are you interested? So I wrote back and said, well, why not? I mean, I thought, there's no harm in this. I don't know how this other job's going to pan out. It may be all right, it may be awful. I never intend to go to the United States, but let Sam have his fling. So then about February, I got another letter saying, do you know, they're warm. It's getting warm, Thimble nearly found. Could you possibly send me on half a sheet of paper just something about yourself? Because they seem to be biting. So I wrote the Churchillian half a sheet of paper and still thinking, and then quite suddenly, on paper, the most ordinary richness and vitality and creaminess, with embossed, this isn't embossed, that is, I got a letter which absolutely astonished me. Dear Professor Rose, we would like you to come and teach at Rice University with round-trip transportation for yourself and your wife. And then it mentioned a salary which was, by my circumstances, utterly astronomical, you see. And signed by Bill K. Lacey, because, you never signed with a middle initial. I mean, that's the most extraordinary thing to do. So he's obviously a very genuine American and all, and they were asking me to do rather a lot of teaching, but in terms of what I'd been teaching, it didn't seem very much. And it was, it was all history of art, which I hadn't taught, but I thought, well, I can do this. And, I don't, the immediate prospect here doesn't seem to be all that wonderful. And then people say, Houston, well, we don't, of course, never heard Rice, don't be silly, but Houston, the British consul in Houston has danger money because the climate is so awful. I mean, we all know that the Foreign Service is a law unto itself. I refuse to know anything about this. I mean, if I start finding out, you ought to read something about it. I I said, well, if I want to start doing that, I never know, and you know that it's totally unreliable. The only way to do something like this is to do it totally blind, make a decision, and then stick to it. So I made a decision, and then it was an extremely busy year. I mean, because there were these negotiations with Sam, and then I wrote a book, and then we bought a house. We just bought a house, and then Jean had an exhibition on January the 10th and a baby on January the 25th. So, I mean, it was incredibly busy. And then I found myself writing to Bill K. Lacey saying, yes, thank you very much indeed. And then packing up the house and reorganizing my books and stocking and storing my paintings and deciding which paintings I should have expedited and which books I should have expedited. And then getting a visa, which in those days was a very, very long-winded, frightening thing. Amongst other things, we had to report at 8 a.m. At the American Embassy in Grosvenor Square, complete, with a 6-month-old baby. And I wrote and I said, look, surely you can't. What with a 6-month-old baby? Do you want to catechize him about his membership of the Communist Party? Do you want, do you want a health certificate? No, we must have this child. I said, well, look, at 8 o'clock in the morning, what sort of provision have you got for Gerber's baby food or something like that? Well, we want him at 8 o'clock in the morning. So we brought him 2 small boys, one aged 4 months at that stage, or 5 months, and the other age of, 2 and a teeny bit. Terrible business, and then, of course, they didn't really want you at 8 o'clock. They just wanted you to knock them under. And from 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock, absolutely nothing happened, except, the line got longer and longer, and people who weren't so obedient, also anxious to get to the United States, arrived. And it took all day. And, by midday, we said, but, these children, they need feeding. What are your... Oh, well, you'll have to fight that out yourself. Really quite outrageous. And then page after page after page, and I'm going to wonder. I said, yes, I had been a member of the Cambridge University Socialist Club. And I thought, well, is that going to do it? And finally, about 4:30 in the afternoon, the sort of young man whom I'd been teaching at Cambridge and hadn't thought very much of, those American students, who come to read an undergraduate degree because they really, their universities weren't any good. The little boy, a little bit older than that, was acting vice consul. And I thought, well, I can get my own back a bit. I said, why is there this absurd? And he said, well, gee, sir, I'm very sorry, sir, but, I've got to get you to swear allegiance. And I said, well, are the children going to swear? Is a 6-month-old? Is he got to take an oath? Well, sir, it's very embarrassing, and you and I said, well, we know it's very embarrassing, but I'm afraid, we have to comply with the... So I said, well, I really do think, how can you lend yourself and so on? But he was a very nice boy, of course, really. And apart from the fact that I determined to make him blush a little bit, all was well. And so we got our resident alien visas. And then I tell you something really very, very funny. I loathe travelling, and I was also a very dutiful boy. And so in the holidays, we almost always went to visit, first of all, my family, and then my wife's family. And we practically never went anywhere else. And there it was, I was now being asked to teach the history of art. So I thought, well, I better go and look at some art. So I dashed off to Italy for only the second time, and I'd never been to Florence. I thought, I can't roll up at Rice University without ever having seen Florence. Because I know these bloody Americans, they go all over the place, they go everywhere. They'll all say, well, you remember that wonderful little trattoria on the Via Galubia? And then I have to say, well, I do remember the Lions Corner House in the Tottenham Court Road. Then they say, well, gee, you like Vicenza? And I'd have to say, no, so I did a whirlwind tour of Italy, so that I was ready for all those key little Rice-ites, who were, of course, extremely sweet and were about to travel and hadn't quite travelled. And the senior man in art right history had travelled many, many years ago and had become a little bit neglectful of this and that and the other, so I wasn't in very great danger from him.
Well, I long to hear of your rice experience, but I think perhaps we better stop.
Well, you know my rice experience, but
Well,
you saw almost every minute of it. But it was the thing that I liked most, I suppose, at Rice was I had an office in the basement of the Fondren Library, which is quite a good library, and there was a particularly nice janitor, and I just adored his greeting. And so I arranged to pass him several times a day because it was absolutely invariable. And we would say good morning, and he would say good morning, and I would say how are you, and then he'd just say this one thing which I could never have enough of: pretty well, Professor, pretty well. And so I'd wait for a couple of hours, and accost him again. I'd say, my dear fellow, how are you? He'd say, pretty well, Professor, pretty well. And that, kept me happy for months. I was strange when I arrived at Rice. Actually, it was a ghastly journey from New York because there was something wrong with the plane, but not enough to tell us to leave the plane. So with a 6-month-old baby and a 2-year-old baby, we sat in August in the airport in New York, and what was wrong was the air conditioning. And it was incredibly hot, and the sweat, of course, very good practice for Houston. The sweat poured off us, and the boys wilted and wilted and wilted, we wonder, little 6 months old, hardly able to breathe. And then finally, three hours later, Sam on the same plane, but much more experienced, and he'd given himself a first-class ticket because Rice was going to pay for it, and I didn't realise that Rice would pay for my first-class ticket, so we weren't doing quite so well. Anyhow, we got into the air. So we arrived at Houston extremely late at night, and there was a great thunderstorm going on, which was very usual for Houston. And Jean didn't like air travel very much, but clash, bang, wallop, the heavens proclaiming the glory of God and the descent of the plane. And so we came in, and it was the second airport I'd ever really been in. It was enormous and garish and wonderful.